Every working day, roughly 20,000 commercial trucks queue at the bridges connecting Nuevo Laredo, Mexico to Laredo, Texas. They form before dawn in a line that stretches back into the desert, engines running. Drivers sleep in the cabs while they wait. Inside the trailers sit wire harnesses, brake calipers, flat-screen panels, refrigerator compressors, surgical gloves, avocados, and the microprocessors that will end up inside American cars. That single crossing handled close to $800 billion of trade in 2025, about 35% of everything moving between the two countries. No American seaport moves more value. No airport comes close. One bridge, one city, one river. 20 years ago, the equivalent scene played out on the other side of the planet. Container ships stacked 8 rows high left Shenzhen and Ningbo for Long Beach, carrying the goods that reorganized American retail and hollowed out American factory towns. Everyone understood what that meant, and the word for it was cheap. A single country had become the workshop bolted onto the American economy, and it rewrote the politics of 2 continents. In 2025, Mexico shipped $534.9 billion of goods to the United States. That was 15.7% of everything America imported. China supplied 9%. Canada supplied 11.2%. The gap is no longer close, and it is no longer new. Mexico took the top spot in 2023 and has widened it every year since, through 2 American administrations that agreed on almost nothing else. So the phrase writes itself. Mexico is becoming America's China. It has the volume, the border, the factories, and the growing surplus. Politicians use the comparison as praise or as warning, depending on the room. Consultants sell it as strategy, with a fee attached. It turns up in earnings calls, campaign speeches, and think tank panels with the same easy confidence. Almost nobody checks whether the 2 situations resemble each other in any way that matters. They do not. The comparison fails in one specific place. That place explains everything that follows: the factories, the trucks, the agreement governing them, and 2 economies welded together at a river neither can move. Being America's workshop is neither compliment nor insult. It is a structural position with fixed features, and they never vary. You supply more than you buy. You absorb the industrial employment the United States sheds. You accumulate leverage nobody intended to hand you. And eventually, you become the thing American politics argues about whenever a plant closes in Ohio. Mexico now occupies that position on every measure that defines it. The United States ran a $196.9 billion goods deficit with Mexico in 2025, up 14.8% in a single year. Only China produced a larger gap, at $202.1 billion, and the 2 lines are converging. Mexico is not merely inheriting China's export volume, it is inheriting China's deficit, and with it, the political attention that a deficit attracts in Washington. The flow runs both ways, which is where the resemblance starts to break. American companies sold $338 billion of goods into Mexico in 2025, making it the largest single destination for United States exports, ahead of Canada at $336.5 billion. Nothing remotely like that existed with China. At the height of that relationship, American exports to China ran barely a quarter of what came back the other way, and much of it was soybeans, aircraft, and scrap. That difference is not a footnote. It describes 2 entirely different machines. The China trade was a pipe. American demand went out, Chinese goods came back, and the value created in between belonged almost entirely to China. The Mexico trade is a loop. A component crosses the border, gets worked on, crosses back, gets worked on again. Engine blocks cast in Michigan become engines in Guanajuato and return inside finished vehicles sold in Texas. Some parts cross the Rio Grande 4 or 5 times before anyone buys the product. Economists call this production sharing. Customs officials call it a nightmare. When a tariff hits a truck at Laredo, it does not strike a foreign product. It strikes a half American one, repeatedly, and the bill lands in Detroit. The arrangement everyone now calls nearshoring was designed 60 years ago, and it was designed to solve an unemployment problem. In December 1964, the United States ended the Bracero program, which had brought Mexican farm laborers north under contract since the Second World War. Hundreds of thousands returned to border towns with no work waiting. Mexico faced 2,000 miles of frontier and nothing to offer it. Mexico's answer arrived the following year, the Border Industrialization Program. Its terms were narrow and precise. A foreign company could ship components into a border zone duty-free, provided everything built there left the country. American tariff rules closed the circuit, taxing only the value added in Mexico when the goods came home. The factories took the name maquiladora, from the toll a miller once collected for grinding somebody else's grain. The metaphor was exact and unflattering. Mexico sold no products of its own. It charged for labor performed on materials it did not own, kept that slice, and returned the rest. The model spread along the border with the discipline of a franchise. By 2000, maquiladoras generated 48% of Mexico's exports. Roughly 90% of the plants sat within a short drive of the United States, and about a third concentrated in a single city. That city was Ciudad Juarez, and it became the purest expression of the arrangement. Television assembly lines ran 3 shifts. Buses collected workers before sunrise from colonias built faster than the water lines meant to serve them. The population tripled in 3 decades. What Juarez never developed was ownership. The designs came from Asia or the United States. The tooling came from Asia or the United States. So did the profit. And so did the decision about whether the plant stayed open. The North American Free Trade Agreement, in force from January 1994, poured accelerant on that structure without redesigning it. Tariffs fell, the border zone rule dissolved, and plants spread south into the Bajío. Volume exploded. The distribution of value barely moved, which is exactly why the next shock landed as hard as it did. On December 11, 2001, China joined the World Trade Organization. For Mexico, that date works the way a closure notice works in a company town. Everything before belongs to one era, everything after to another, and it took years for anyone to notice which one they were in. The logic was brutal and simple. Mexico's advantage had been cheap labor close to the American market. China offered labor at a fraction of Mexican wages, backed by state-built infrastructure, subsidized inputs, and a managed exchange rate. Proximity lost to price when a 40-foot container crossed the Pacific for a couple of $1,000s, and inventory financing cost almost nothing. Plants closed along the border within 2 years. Economists studying maquiladora survival found that Chinese competition sharply raised plant mortality in precisely the categories where the two countries overlapped: textiles, footwear, consumer electronics, toys, small appliances. Studies of Mexican local labor markets traced the damage inland, into wages and informal work in regions that never hosted a competing factory. The maquiladora sector contracted about 20% by early 2002, shedding nearly 290,000 jobs. In Ciudad Juarez, employment fell 27% from its October 2000 peak. Mexico's share of American imports flattened and stayed flat for 2 decades. It stood near 11% in 2000. By 2010, it had barely moved. The country did not deindustrialize. Automotive and aerospace kept expanding, and the Bajío grew into an engineering cluster. But Mexico stopped gaining ground on the only competitor that mattered. A political generation came of age inside that stagnation. NAFTA promised convergence with the North. What arrived was a 20-year draw, and a national argument about whether the deal was worth signing. This is the part of the story that vanishes whenever someone calls Mexico the new China. Mexico already lost to China once, decisively, on terrain it had spent 35 years building. The useful question is not whether Mexico is winning now. It is what actually changed and whether the change belongs to Mexico or was lent to it. Almost nothing about Mexico improved dramatically between 2018 and 2023. Wages rose rather than fell. Productivity growth stayed modest. Security did not transform. What changed was the price of the alternative, and it changed by decision rather than by market forces. The sequence reconstructs easily. In 2018, the United States imposed Section 301 tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars of Chinese goods, and those tariffs survived a change of administration without meaningful revision. In 2020, factory shutdowns exposed how many American supply chains ran through one country. In March 2021, a container ship wedged across the Suez Canal for 6 days, halting roughly 12% of global trade. Later that year, ocean freight rates from Asia to the West Coast rose to multiples of their historical level, while dozens of ships waited off Long Beach. In 2022, a A semiconductor shortage idled American assembly plants that had ordered chips from 8,000 miles away. Each event pushed the same calculation the same way. A procurement manager comparing Shenzhen to Saltillo no longer compared unit cost alone. She was pricing in a 25% tariff, 6 weeks of ocean transit, 3 weeks of port congestion, 90 days of inventory financing, and a non-trivial chance the entire route closes without notice. Saltillo is 3 days from Detroit by truck. A Mexican supplier can be visited on a Tuesday and audited on a Wednesday, in the same time zone, under a contract enforceable in a court an American lawyer understands. By 2023, the arithmetic had inverted, and the trade statistics recorded it immediately. Mexico passed China as the largest source of American imports for the first time since 2001. The margin was not narrow, and it kept widening. 2 years later, Mexico's 15.7% share stood nearly 7 points above China's, a gap that had taken China a decade to build in the other direction. Notice which factor did the work. American policy raised the cost of the alternative, and geography collected the difference. That distinction is the hinge of this entire story, because policy can be rewritten in an afternoon, and geography cannot. Follow the capital, and it does not spread across Mexico evenly. It concentrates in a narrow band of states with the roads, water rights, and substations to carry heavy manufacturing. Nuevo León, Coahuila, Chihuahua, Baja California, and a central cluster in the Bajío spanning Guanajuato, Querétaro, and Aguas Calientes. Most of Mexico joins this boom the way most of America joined Silicon Valley. Monterrey sits at the center. The metro holds roughly 203 million square feet of industrial space, enough to rank among North America's largest industrial markets. Its advantage is unglamorous and decisive. 200 kilometers to Laredo on a freight highway, plus industrial groups who permit, finance, and deliver a factory shell in 9 months. Monterrey did not become an industrial city in 2023. It has been one since the 1890s, when its breweries and, soon after, its steelworks made it Mexico's first modern industrial center. The boom announced itself first in rent. Industrial rents across northern Mexico rose 39% during 2024, pushing some submarkets toward pricing comparable to Miami. Developers who spent a decade building speculative warehouses on thin margins suddenly had tenants signing before the concrete cured. Land in Apodaca and Santa Catarina traded at prices that enriched brokers and forced manufacturers to redo their site studies. Some tenants signed for space that did not yet have a roof. Guanajuato tells the same story in a different accent. The Bajío grew around automotive assembly rather than border maquiladoras. That produced deeper supplier networks and a workforce trained in tolerances, not throughput. General Motors in Silao, Honda in Celaya, Mazda in Salamanca, Toyota in Apaseo El Grande. When a Japanese or German Tier 1 supplier evaluates a Mexican site today, the Bajío competes on engineering capability, not on the hourly rate, and it usually wins. That concentration is simultaneously Mexico's greatest strength and its sharpest fragility. Everything built in those states has to reach the United States, and almost all of it reaches the United States through the same place. Nearly everything described so far funnels through a handful of bridges in one Texas city of roughly 250,000 people. Port Laredo processed close to $800 billion in 2025 and carried about 35% of all United States-Mexico trade. Roughly 20,000 commercial crossings pass daily. Automotive leads the mix, then technology components and heavy machinery, with a growing cold chain moving Mexican produce north. Compare how Chinese exports reach America, and the structural difference appears at once. Chinese goods arrive through many ports on 2 coasts, aboard ships carrying up to 20,000 containers each, with weeks of transit acting as a buffer. If Long Beach jams, cargo diverts to Savannah or Houston. The ocean absorbs the delay, and the slack costs nothing. Laredo has no slack whatsoever. A truck is 1 load, 1 driver, 1 customs entry, and 1 crossing window. When inspection intensity rises at the World Trade Bridge, the queue lengthens within hours, and an assembly plant in Michigan running 4 hours of line-side inventory feels it the same day. In 2019, and again in 2022, Extra state inspections at Texas crossings created delays measured in days. Automakers warned publicly about stopping lines. Perishable loads spoiled in the queue. A crossing that works is invisible. A crossing that stalls shows up in a Michigan production report within a day. The infrastructure response has been real and slow. More than $1.5 billion has gone into crossing capacity, joint inspection operations, and cold storage. A fifth Laredo span has sat in planning for years. Freight grows faster than the concrete, and the value crossing each lane rises every year. So the most valuable trade corridor on the planet passes through a bottleneck that a labor action, a security incident, or a policy announcement can constrict in an afternoon. That vulnerability is inseparable from the advantage that created it. Proximity is precisely what makes the choke point possible, and precisely what makes it worth defending. Here, the analogy with China fails on its own terms. China's rise rested on labor that stayed cheap for 2 decades while output climbed. Mexico does close to the opposite, on purpose, as declared policy under 2 consecutive presidents. Mexico's general minimum wage reached 315.04 pesos per working day in 2026, after a 13% increase. The northern border zone, where most export manufacturing operates, reached 440.87 pesos. Cumulatively, the minimum wage has risen 256.6% since 2018, 9 consecutive years of double-digit increases, sustained through a pandemic, an inflation spike, and a change of government. The effect on export factories is direct and measurable. Average real monthly pay inside Mexico's export manufacturing program reached about $1,253 in February 2026. It rose 2.4% in a year, while employment in those same plants fell. Wages up and headcount down is the signature of automation, not expansion. A company choosing Mexico in 2026 is not choosing the cheapest labor available. Vietnam undercuts it. India undercuts it. Much of Southeast Asia undercuts it. What it buys is 3-day truck transit and conditional duty-free access to the largest consumer market on Earth. Layered on top sits a wage floor written directly into the trade agreement. The labor value content rule requires that a rising share of vehicle content originate in facilities paying at least $16 an hour. Washington wrote the provision to blunt the incentive to move American auto jobs south. Inside Mexico, it created a wage tier that did not exist before, concentrated in the one industry American customs can audit. The trend is not slowing. In February 2026, Mexico approved cutting the legal workweek from 48 hours to 40, 2 hours a year from 2027 to 2030, with no reduction in pay. Mexico is therefore competing as a middle-cost, high-access producer, selling proximity and legal privilege rather than cheapness. That is a defensible strategy, and arguably a better one. It is not China's strategy, and it cannot produce China's volumes or China's employment. Strip away the aggregates, and the Mexican export economy resolves into one dominant sector, with everything else arranged around it. In 2025, Mexican plants built 3,953,494 vehicles and exported 3,385,785 of them. 78% of those exports went to the United States. Against American sales of 16.2 million light vehicles that year, roughly 1 in 6 vehicles sold in the country was assembled south of the Rio Grande. That concentration is both the achievement and the exposure. Nearly every global automaker builds in Mexico. General Motors, Ford, Stellantis, Volkswagen, Nissan, Toyota, Honda, Mazda, Kia, BMW, Audi, Mercedes-Benz. Around them sits a supplier base of thousands of firms producing seats, wiring harnesses, transmissions, castings, and stampings, most of it within a day's drive of a final assembly line. Remove the automotive complex, and Mexico's trade surplus with the United States largely disappears. Domestic sales held up better than exports, rising 1.4% to 1.5 million vehicles, the third best year on record. The 2025 figures carried a warning inside them. Production fell 0.9%, and exports fell 2.7%, mild aggregate declines that concealed severe individual results. Volkswagen's Mexican production dropped 12.2%, and its exports 16.2%. Mazda's exports fell 37.6%. Honda's production fell 18.4%. Nissan cut production 12.2%. General Motors fell 3.6%, and Stellantis 5.5%. These are not companies abandoning Mexico. They are companies holding still while they wait to learn what a vehicle built in Puebla will cost to sell in Ohio. The uncertainty traces to one instrument. In March 2025, the United States imposed a 25% tariff on imported automobiles, with carve-outs calculated on the American content inside Mexican and Canadian vehicles. A carve-out calculated on content is not a stable rule. It is a formula, and a formula can be re-specified by people who did not build the factory. Every automaker's Mexican investment case now depends on how that specification gets written, which raises a question that turns out to govern the entire relationship. Who decides what counts as North American? The most consequential text in this relationship is not a tariff schedule. It is a set of technical rules almost nobody outside customs law reads, and they determine whether a vehicle assembled in Mexico crosses the border free of duty or pays full freight. Under USMCA, a passenger vehicle must contain 75% North American content by value to qualify, raised from 62.5% under NAFTA. Core parts including engines, transmissions, and bodies carry their own separate thresholds. 70% of a producer's steel and aluminum purchases must originate inside the region. And the labor value content rule requires 40 to 45% of vehicle content to come from operations paying at least $16 an hour. Miss any one of them and the whole vehicle loses preference. Read together, the design is unmistakable. These rules do not tax foreign goods. They dictate the supplier map several tiers deep. A Mexican plant that sources a Chinese transmission fails the core parts test and loses duty-free treatment for the entire finished vehicle, not just the transmission. So it sources regionally, and a supplier in Coahuila or Ontario or Kentucky wins a contract it would have lost on price alone. The rulebook is industrial policy wearing a customs uniform. This is the mechanism that makes Mexico's position structurally unlike China's. China exported into an open tariff schedule and competed on cost. Mexico exports into a rulebook that specifies where its inputs may come from, verified by American customs authorities with penalties and retroactive duty assessments for failure. Access is not a right, it is a conditional privilege, retested with every shipment. Enforcement remains the acknowledged weak point, and American negotiators say so publicly. Certification rests substantially on producer self-declaration. Tracing the true origin of a wire harness through 4 tiers of suppliers is slow and expensive work that customs agencies are not staffed to do at scale. As one assessment of the 2026 review put it, rules of origin are only as good as the tools that enforce them. That gap is where the China question enters. 20 kilometers north of Monterrey, on the highway running toward Laredo, sits an industrial park that did not exist a decade ago. Hofusan Industrial Park covers 8.47 square kilometers of what used to be ranch land. 2 Chinese groups, Holly and Futong, founded it in 2017 together with the Santos family, Mexican landowners who supplied the ground and the local relationships. The park has absorbed more than $1 billion and now houses roughly 40 businesses, with another billion announced for expansion. Its tenant list reads like a directory of Chinese consumer manufacturing. Manhua, the Hong Kong furniture group whose recliners fill American showrooms. Hisense, the appliance and television maker. Auto parts suppliers feeding assembly plants a few hours away. The rural road serving the site has been widened to 4 lanes, and the development plan includes hotels, housing, and shopping. A company town in everything but the name. The location was chosen with a stopwatch. 200 kilometers to Laredo means a truck loaded Monday clears customs Tuesday and reaches a Texas distribution center Wednesday. A container leaving Ningbo on the same Monday would still be at sea 2 weeks later, and its owner would still be paying to finance the goods inside it. Hofusan is the most visible instance of a broader shift. Chinese activity shifted from buying to building after 2020. Nearly 85% of major Chinese transactions in Mexico between 2020 and 2024 were greenfield construction, not acquisitions. Roughly 40 Chinese auto parts suppliers were operating in Mexico as of May 2025, together accounting for around 3% of Mexican production in their segment. BYD spent 2 years evaluating a Mexican assembly plant before the political climate turned against it and the plan went quiet. To an American policymaker studying satellite imagery of Chinese-built factories a 2-day drive from Dallas, One conclusion suggests itself instantly. The back door is open, and China is walking through it. The conclusion is intuitive, widely repeated, and mostly unsupported by the measurements. The data does not sustain the strongest version of the claim, and the distance between the perception and the measurement is wide enough to matter for policy. Mexico's official statistics record $2.3 billion in net Chinese foreign direct investment between 2017 and 2024. Including Hong Kong, lifts it to $3.2 billion, about 1.2% of all foreign investment Mexico received across those 8 years. Over the same period, American companies invested $113 billion, roughly 40% of the total. China ranks behind Canada, Japan, Germany, and Spain. Those official figures understate reality, and researchers say so plainly. Chinese firms route capital through Hong Kong, Singapore, and other jurisdictions, so the ultimate owner disappears from Mexican registries before the money lands. Independent estimates from the Rhodium Group and Rice University's Baker Institute put the true cumulative figure between $11.5 and $15 billion. The gap is not small. Mexico logged $76 million of Chinese investment in one quarter of 2025, while Rhodium counted roughly $1.1 billion realized across the half. One estimate from Mexico's National University reaches $22.5 billion in accumulated stock. Take the largest credible number, and Chinese investment still amounts to roughly 10 to 13% of what American companies committed over the same years. The content question produces a parallel answer. Analysis cited by the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas puts Chinese value added at about 7% of Mexico's goods exports to the United States. Mexican domestic content runs near 51% across manufactured exports and above 50% in automobiles specifically. American content contributes about 17% overall and 20% in the auto sector. In advanced electronics, the picture inverts. Domestic content falls to between 12 and 20% and to 16% in semiconductors, which is where the concern has real footing. Research from Mexico's central bank found little evidence of pure re-export, goods entering Mexico and departing unchanged under a new label. What the data shows instead is American companies operating in Mexico that keep buying from suppliers they have used for 20 years, many of them Chinese. That is a different problem from smuggling. It is harder to legislate against, and it is considerably larger. While Mexico's surplus with the United States expanded, a second imbalance grew underneath it, pointing the opposite direction, and Mexican officials discuss it far less often. In the first half of 2025 alone, Mexico's trade deficit with China reached $57.5 billion, a record. Mexico bought $62.1 billion of Chinese goods and sold China $4.6 billion. The ratio is roughly 13 to 1. A decade earlier, across the first half of 2015, the same deficit stood at $32.8 billion. It has nearly doubled in 10 years, and it grew fastest during the exact period when Mexico was supposedly displacing China. In those 6 months, Chinese imports rose 2.3%, while Mexican sales to China fell 4.5%. Examine what those imports contain, and the mechanism becomes visible. They are not primarily finished consumer goods on retail shelves. They are intermediate inputs: electronic components, steel products, industrial machinery, chemicals, electric motors, printed circuit boards, and the tooling used to make everything else. Mexican factories buy them, transform them, and ship the result north. The Chinese share of value per finished unit stays modest, which is what the 7% figure captures. Value share and dependency are different measurements, and confusing them produces bad policy. A Mexican appliance plant that loses access to Chinese compressors does not change suppliers within a quarter. Depending on the component, there may be no alternative supplier at the required scale anywhere outside China. The exposure is not about how much of the price is Chinese. It is about whether a substitute exists. And for a growing list of components, the honest answer is no. This leaves Mexico in a genuinely awkward position. It runs a large surplus with a partner that increasingly demands it purge Chinese content, while running a large deficit with the country supplying the inputs that make the surplus possible. Both relationships are load-bearing. Both are pulling in opposite directions. And Mexico has spent 2 years trying to resolve the contradiction in public. On January 1st, 2026, Mexico raised tariffs of 5 to 50% on 1,463 categories of goods from countries lacking a Mexican free trade agreement. The list covers automobiles, textiles, clothing, steel, plastics, footwear, furniture, toys, aluminum, and glass. Affected countries include China, India, South Korea, Thailand, Indonesia, Brazil, South Africa, and the United Arab Emirates. Chinese vehicles drew the maximum rate of 50%. Mexico holds free trade agreements reaching some 50 countries, so the measure targets a short list by design. The Economy Ministry framed the measure in strictly domestic terms, protecting roughly 350,000 jobs in sensitive sectors and supporting what it called sovereign, sustainable, and inclusive re-industrialization. The government projected 70 billion pesos, about $3.8 billion in annual revenue. Nobody in Mexico City or Washington missed the timing, which landed as American officials were pressing Mexico on Chinese imports ahead of the trade agreement's mandatory review. Sheinbaum proposed the package in September 2025. The Chamber of Deputies passed a softened version in December by 281 votes to 24, leaving the vehicle rate untouched, and Beijing called the result discriminatory. The tariffs sit inside a larger program. Plan Mexico, announced in January 2025, sets targets with unusual specificity for an industrial strategy. Lift Mexico to the 10th largest economy in the world by 2030, up from 13th. Raise investment above 25% of GDP from 2026. Create 1.5 million manufacturing and strategic sector jobs. Increase domestic content in manufactured goods by 15 percentage points. Cut the time to approve an investment from 2.6 years to 1. As strategy, Plan Mexico is coherent and honest about its constraints. It concedes that Mexico cannot win a labor cost contest and bets instead on regional integration, supplier depth, and privileged access to American demand. It treats the Chinese input dependency as an engineering problem to be dismantled over a decade, rather than a betrayal to be denounced. A digital investment window was built to compress permitting. Read against results, the first year tells a considerably harder story, and the hardest numbers are the ones about jobs. 1 year into Plan Mexico, Mexico's own Competitiveness Institute rated the program's economic growth and competitiveness indicators red, and its assessment used the word unflattering. The numbers behind that verdict are specific. Investment fell to 22% of GDP in the third quarter of 2025, down from 24.8% a year earlier, moving away from the 25% target rather than toward it. The economy grew 0.4% through the third quarter, against an IMF projection of 1%, and the third quarter itself contracted 0.2%. Domestic content in manufactured goods rose to 44.2% from 42.6%, a pace nowhere near what a 15-point gain by 2030 would require. Mexico ranked 55th of 69 economies on the Institute's competitiveness measure, and analysts had already cut 2026 growth forecasts to below 2%. The employment figure is the one that should stop the conversation. Mexican manufacturing shed 127,200 jobs during 2025, the worst annual result since 2008. Total formal job creation across the whole economy reached 278,697 positions, against a target implying roughly 1.2 million a year. That is roughly a fifth of the plan, delivered in the plan's first year. Labor poverty declined only modestly to 34.3%, leaving 44.9 million Mexicans without enough income to cover basic food. The export manufacturing program tells the same story over a longer horizon. As of February 2026, Mexico's IMEX program covered 6,513 establishments, employing 3,156,839 workers. Of those, 5,217 were factories, and the rest served agriculture, trade, and services. Employment fell 2.6% year over year, the fifth consecutive annual decline. 5 straight years of shrinking payrolls in the export sector, running through the exact period that every consultancy, bank, and government in the hemisphere described as a nearshoring boom. Either the story is wrong, or the measurement is wrong. It turns out to be the measurement, and correcting it changes what the boom actually was. Mexico's foreign direct investment hit a record in 2025, and outlets worldwide reported the figure as proof of the nearshoring thesis. The total passed $40.9 billion, a fifth consecutive annual increase, and Mexican officials cited it constantly. Open the composition, and the picture reverses. Mexico received $34.3 billion in the first half of 2025, up 10.2%. Reinvested earnings accounted for $29 billion of it, 84.4% of the total. New investment accounted for $3.1 billion, or 9.2%. That single line is the most important number in this entire story. Reinvested earnings are profits that a foreign company already operating in Mexico decided to leave in Mexico rather than send home. That is a real vote of confidence, and it is not the same event as a factory arriving. A German auto supplier expanding a Puebla plant it has run since 1998 appears in the identical statistic as a company breaking ground for the first time. In 2025, the first case supplied almost all of it, and the second case supplied less than $1.10. The source breakdown reinforces the point rather than complicating it. The United States supplied $14.7 billion, or 43%, followed by Spain at $5.9 billion, Canada at $1.75 billion, Japan at $1.44 billion, and Germany at $1.28 billion. These are the same investors who were already there before anyone said the word nearshoring. Manufacturing took about 36% of the total. The genuinely new projects tend to be mid-sized rather than transformative. A few $100 million for a plant in San Luis Potosí, not a wave of relocations. The record is being set by incumbents compounding their existing positions, not by a migration of global supply chains out of Asia. That reframing dissolves the contradiction between record investment and 5 years of falling factory employment. Existing plants reinvest profits, automate, run leaner, and hire fewer people. The Great Relocation has been real, but far smaller and far slower than the language surrounding it. And part of the reason is physical. China's industrial ascent was underwritten by state capacity that most countries cannot reproduce at any price. Between 2005 and 2020, China built the world's largest high-speed rail network from nothing, added generating capacity exceeding entire continents, and delivered deep-water ports roughly on schedule. When a province needed power for a new industrial zone, the power appeared, and the question of who paid got settled later. Mexico's constraint is the mirror image. The national grid, run by the state utility CFE, has struggled to add transmission and generation fast enough for the demand already connected. Industrial users in the north report voltage instability and interconnection queues measured in years rather than months. A data center or semiconductor facility needing firm power at scale often cannot get a reliable date. Manufacturers who came to Mexico for proximity discovered they had to budget for their own substation and sometimes their own generation. Water is the harder ceiling because no amount of capital fixes it quickly. The industrial corridor sits in some of Mexico's driest territory. In 2022, Monterrey, the center of the entire boom, rationed household water for months as its reservoirs fell to a fraction of capacity, while factories kept operating on separate concessions. The state has since expanded supply through new aqueducts, but the underlying arithmetic is unchanged. Adding water-intensive manufacturing to an arid basin requires infrastructure measured in decades and litigation measured in the same units. Security imposes a third cost that appears in no official comparison of manufacturing locations. Cargo theft fell 21.5% during 2025, a genuine improvement driven by new federal security plans. But the exposure stays concentrated on the corridors that matter most: the state of Mexico, Puebla, San Luis Potosí, Michoacán, and Nuevo León. Semi-trucks accounted for 41% of stolen vehicles. Shippers pay for armed escorts, GPS convoy monitoring, and daylight-only routing, and those costs never show up in a wage comparison. None of these constraints is fatal on its own. Together, they cap how fast Mexico can absorb capital, and that cap sits below the demand, which is only the first of two ceilings. The second ceiling is legal, and over the past year, it became the more urgent of the two by a wide margin. On February 20th, 2026, the United States Supreme Court struck down the tariffs imposed under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. Those included the duties on Mexican and Canadian goods justified by drug and migrant flows. Collection stopped 4 days later at midnight on February 24th. Within the hour, the administration imposed a 10% global tariff under Section 122 of the Trade Act, a statute capped at 15% in 150 days. USMCA-compliant Mexican and Canadian goods were exempted, alongside critical minerals, energy, pharmaceuticals, and aerospace products. Read that sequence carefully. A court struck down the tariff architecture governing the largest trading relationship on Earth. A temporary instrument with an expiry date replaced it within 96 hours, while officials previewed fresh investigations to build something durable. For a company weighing $400 million on a Mexican plant with a 20-year payback, that is not a rulebook. It is a weather report. Then came July 1st, 2026. Under Article 34.7, the three governments met for the agreement's mandatory 6-year joint review. Mexico and Canada both supported extending it a further 16 years. The United States Trade Representative declined, stating that the United States did not agree to renew the agreement in its current form. Bilateral talks with Mexico on rules of origin and economic security continued in Mexico City later that month, a third round in a negotiation nobody had planned for. The agreement did not die, and the distinction matters. Every USMCA right remains fully in force through July 1st, 2036, and the three parties may extend it at any time by written confirmation. But the mechanism changed shape permanently. The Commission must now conduct a joint review every single year until 2036. The most valuable supply chain in the world now runs on an agreement renewed 12 months at a time. Capital responds to that uncertainty predictably, and Mexican industrial real estate registered it before the trade statistics did. For 6 consecutive quarters, new industrial supply has outpaced demand. Absorption peaked in 2022 at roughly 43 million square feet and has fallen since. Vacancy is climbing in the border markets that led the boom, including Ciudad Juárez and Reynosa, where developers are extending delivery timelines rather than completing buildings into a soft market. Markets organized around advanced manufacturing, Querétaro, Guadalajara, Tijuana, have held up better. That gap reveals which demand was durable and which was speculative. Tesla's Nuevo León plant became the emblem of the pause. Announced in March 2023, with land assembled, water rights negotiated, and state incentives arranged, the project was suspended in 2024 pending clarity on American trade policy and has not restarted since. The site sits largely empty beside the highway. Every industrial developer in Monterrey drives past it, and every one of them understands what it means. Water rights and incentives do not build a factory when the tariff rate is unknown. A parallel signal appeared in household income rather than corporate accounts. Remittances from workers in the United States fell 4.6% during 2025 to $61.79 billion, the first annual decline in 11 years, ending a run during which the flow nearly tripled. That money funds consumption in precisely the states that supply factory labor, and it arrives without conditions, tariffs, or rules of origin. For many Mexican households, it matters more than any investment announcement, and it is the clearest sign that the American labor market stopped pulling. If this channel has been useful to you, subscribe and share it with someone who argues about supply chains. Tell us in the comments which trade relationship you want examined next, because the real question was never whether Mexico is booming. It is what Mexico is actually becoming. Set the two relationships side by side, and the differences turn out to be structural rather than cosmetic. China was a strategic rival American policy chose to enrich, on the theory that commercial integration would produce political convergence. It did not. And when Washington decided to reverse course, it could. Tariffs, export controls, and investment screening were applied to an economy with which the United States shared no border, no treaty obligation, and no production line. The cost was enormous, and the option genuinely existed. Mexico offers no such option, and every American administration discovers this within about a month. The two economies are not trading partners in the ordinary sense. They are one manufacturing system, operating under two flags, with components crossing the border repeatedly before anything is finished. A tariff on a Mexican vehicle taxes American engines, American steel, American software, and American engineering hours. The Ford plant in Hermosillo and the Ford plant in Michigan sit on the same balance sheet. That is why every tariff aimed at Mexico has arrived with a carve-out attached, and why the carve-outs keep getting rewritten. So the comparison collapses exactly where it matters. Mexico has China's export volume and something close to China's trade surplus, but it does not have China's independence. Its access is conditional on a rulebook drafted in Washington, audited by American customs officers, contingent on wage floors set by a foreign legislature, and now renewed annually. China built leverage. Mexico built dependence, with better logistics. It is becoming something without precedent, an economy carrying the deficit without the leverage, and the scrutiny without the sovereignty. Trap or foundation is being decided now, in unglamorous choices about power, water, supplier depth, and how much Chinese input Mexico will surrender to keep American access. Foxconn is building a facility in Guadalajara, roughly 450 meters long, to assemble NVIDIA's GB200 systems, the highest value manufacturing ever attempted on Mexican soil. That plant is the entire optimistic case in one building, and it exists because Mexico is close, not because Mexico is cheap. 20,000 trucks will cross at Laredo tomorrow morning, and the morning after. What nobody can tell you is what they will owe when they arrive, because that answer now gets decided every July.